I didn't ruin my life in one dramatic mistake. I didn't lose everything overnight. No collapse. No scandal. No moment you could point to and say, that's where it went wrong. That's the hardest part to explain. I lost myself politely. Gradually. With everyone's approval. If you had asked me years ago whether I was living my own life, I would have said yes without hesitation. I was doing everything right. Making sensible choices. Avoiding unnecessary risks. Following paths that had already been tested and approved by people who cared about me. At least, that's what I told myself. The truth is, I confused acceptance with belonging. From early on, I learned what was expected of me. Not explicitly, no one ever sat me down and handed me a script. It was subtler than that. Praises for certain behaviors. Silence when I showed others. Raised eyebrows. Gentle corrections disguised as advice. You're good at this. This suits you. Why would you want something so uncertain? Each comment was harmless on its own. Together, they formed a map not of who I was, but of who I was allowed to be. I followed it willingly. It felt safe to choose what made sense to others. Safe to stay within visible lines. Safe to become reliable, predictable, respectable. I learned quickly that approval comes easier when you don't ask uncomfortable questions. So I stopped asking. I told myself that desire was overrated. That fulfillment came from stability. That wanting something different was childish, selfish, unrealistic. And for a long time, that worked. I built a life that looked complete from the outside. Responsibilities. Commitments. A future that could be explained in a few neat sentences. People were proud of me. They trusted my judgment. They assumed I was content. I never corrected them. Inside, something else was happening, something quiet enough to ignore, but persistent enough to wear me down. I felt disconnected from my own decisions. As if I was watching someone else navigate my life using logic instead of instinct. I did what made sense, not what felt right. I chose paths that minimized disappointment mostly for others. Every time a small voice inside me suggested a different direction, I treated it like an interruption. An inconvenience. Something to be managed rather than listened to. That voice grew quieter over time. Not gone, just tired. There's a specific kind of grief that comes from realizing you are good at a life you don't want. I was efficient, capable, dependable. I met expectations effortlessly. And each success reinforced the illusion that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. But late at night, when the world stopped asking things of me, I felt an unamiable emptiness. Not sadness. Not despair. Absence. I couldn't articulate what was missing, only that something essential had been left behind somewhere along the way. And the longer I stayed on the path I was praised for, the harder it became to imagine stepping off it, because what would I say that I didn't choose this, that I agreed out of fear, that I let other people's comfort guide my life? Those explanations sounded weak even to me. So I kept going. Years passed like that. Smoothly. Quietly. Respectably. And with each year, the distance between who I was and who I might have been widened just enough to avoid panic, but never enough to ignore. Until one moment forced me to look directly at it. Not a crisis. A mirror. I was asked a simple question: is this what you wanted? I opened my mouth to answer and nothing came out. Because for the first time, I realized I didn't know. And that realization was the beginning of something irreversible. That question stayed with me longer than it should have. Is this what you wanted? It echoed in the background of everything I did. While I worked. While I spoke. While I smiled at the right moments. It didn't accuse me. It didn't demand an answer. It simply waited, patient and heavy, like something that knew it would eventually be heard. I started paying attention to my reactions in ways I never had before. not to events but to myself. I noticed how often I felt relief when plans were cancelled. How rarely I felt excitement about things I had once claimed were important. How my days felt full but strangely empty at the same time, like a calendar packed with obligations that didn't belong to me. I realized I was living on autopilot. Not because I was lazy. Because I was afraid. Afraid of what might surface if I slowed down long enough to listen. The first crack appeared in a moment that should have been joyful. A milestone. Something people congratulated me for. I stood there, surrounded by approval, and felt absolutely nothing. No pride. No satisfaction. Just a distant awareness that I had reached a point I was supposed to want and didn't. That scared me more than failure ever could. Failure at least implies desire. Success without desire feels like a trap. I tried to fix it the way responsible people do by optimizing. I adjusted routines. Set new goals. Told myself I just needed novelty, rest, perspective. I read articles about burnout, watched videos about gratitude, made lists of things I should appreciate. None of it worked. Because the problem wasn't exhaustion. It was misalignment. I had been living in constant agreement with a life that never asked who I was, only whether I was willing to comply. The more I saw that, the harder it became to ignore the resentment building quietly underneath. Not anger toward others, resentment toward myself for being so cooperative in my own disappearance. I started remembering moments I had dismissed years earlier. Small crossroads. Invitations I declined because they felt impractical. Ideas I abandoned because no one else seemed enthusiastic. Versions of myself I labeled unrealistic before they even had a chance to breathe. Each memory landed with a dull ache. I wasn't grieving a single lost opportunity, I was grieving a pattern. There was one evening when it finally became impossible to pretend. I was alone, sitting in a room filled with things I had chosen carefully, logically, responsibly. Everything in that space reflected good decisions. And yet, I felt like a guest in my own life. I asked myself something I had avoided for years: if no one were watching, what would I choose? The answer came quickly and shocked me. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't ambitious. It wasn't even particularly impressive. It was simply different. Different enough to disappoint people. Different enough to disrupt the narrative everyone had built around me, including myself. That was the moment the moral dilemma became unavoidable. If I stayed on this path, I would remain accepted, supported, and quietly miserable. If I changed direction, I would cause confusion, discomfort, maybe even pain, but for the first time, the life I lived would be intentional. There was no version of the future that didn't involve loss. The question wasn't whether I would lose something, but what I was willing to lose. The image of my life stretching forward unchanged felt unbearable. Not because it was bad, but because it was closed. Finished. Already decided. I understood then that staying wasn't neutral. It was a choice with consequences just as real as leaving. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider something terrifying: that loyalty to expectations can become a form of self-betrayal. Once that thought took root, it refused to leave. I didn't change my life all at once. That's another fantasy. People like to believe that there's a single brave moment, a clean break, a dramatic announcement that rewrites everything. What I did was quieter. And harder. I began by telling the truth in places where I had always stayed vague. Not everything. Not to everyone. Just enough to stop lying to myself. I said no to things I would have automatically accepted before. I admitted uncertainty where I had always pretended confidence. I stopped defending choices I no longer believed in. Each small act felt dangerous, like stepping onto unstable ground. Every time I disrupted expectations, I felt the familiar pull of guilt, the urge to explain, to soften, to retreat. But something else appeared alongside the fear. Relief. Not the euphoric kind. The kind that feels like oxygen returning after a long time underwater. People noticed, of course. They always do when you stop playing the role they've memorized. Some reacted with concern. Some with confusion. Some with subtle disappointment that cut deeper than open criticism. "You've changed," they said. And for the first time, I didn't rush to apologize. Change came with consequences. Relationships shifted. Some grew distant. Some revealed that they had been built more on consistency than connection. I learned that when you stop being predictable, you also stop being convenient. That hurt. I grieved the version of myself that had been easy to rely on. The one who never complicated things. The one who absorbed discomfort so others wouldn't have to. But I also grieved something else: the years I had spent confusing endurance with purpose. I started making choices that didn't make sense to anyone but me. Not reckless ones. Honest ones. Choices that aligned with how I felt rather than how I was perceived. The life I stepped into wasn't instantly happier. It was messy. Less certain. Sometimes lonelier. But it was alive in a way my old life had never been. I began to feel things again: doubt, excitement, fear, curiosity, not as problems to be solved, but as signals. Evidence that I was present. The emptiness that once haunted me didn't vanish completely. It softened. It became less accusatory, more reflective. A reminder of what happens when I trade my voice for approval. I don't blame anyone for the life I lived before. No one forced me into it. I chose it repeatedly because it felt safer than disappointing people I cared about. That's the truth I had to accept. Responsibility doesn't always mean blame. Sometimes it simply means ownership. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself, the quiet compliance, the gradual self-erasure, the feeling that your life is happening around you instead of through you, understand this: you don't have to destroy your life to reclaim it. You don't need permission to want something different. And it's not too late just because you stayed too long. I lived the life they chose for me. And I almost convinced myself it was enough. But the moment I stopped pretending, even imperfectly, even slowly, I started becoming someone real again. And that, finally, feels like living.